Hello, I'm Lily, and these are the porcelain dolls that I make. And I make my own molds to make these, and I'm going to show you how. Now, this isn't a full tutorial on making a mold, but I wanted to show you the process that it takes for me to create these pieces for my dolls. And this in particular is a pair of feet, blank feet, that I then pour in porcelain and then make shoes from. So I'm starting out by drawing what they call parting lines along the feet. This is going to be a two-part mold, so the parting line will go down the middle of each foot. And I will bury the feet up into that parting line for one half, and then the other half will be the second part. So I use just like regular Sculpey clay, press down. This is kind of my dirty little mat and my dirty little roller, but making molds is really, really messy. And so my surfaces are pretty dirty. This part I'm doing inside my studio in the house, but then I do the rest of it, the plaster, out in my she shed. I'm just using a straight edge ruler here to cut a nice straight line. I want this mold to be rectangle, and each piece has a spout, I think it's called a spare, that I create after I embed these halfway into the clay. So I'm just preparing the clay bed to be able to have a mold box put around it. I hope I'm making sense. I know all these terms are like, what are you talking about? So I'm not a professional mold maker by any means, but I've done it enough so that it works for me, and I can create my one-of-a-kind dolls this way. And I would love to resell them, but they're just not professional enough. But if you ever want to try your hand at it, there are many resources on how to make a plaster mold. This is a very simple two-part plaster mold. So I've pushed them down a little bit into the clay so that I can create an outline with an X-Acto knife here. And then I'm going to cut out some of the clay inside of that outline and then bury that foot up to the halfway mark that I made. So even though this is a real simple mold, a two-part mold, and it's a simple sculpt feet, there is something to keep in mind when you're making molds is what they call undercuts. And if you do more exploration into plaster mold making, undercuts are something you want to avoid. The plaster that we pour over the top of this could form under these outcroppings or undercuts of the model and then lock the model inside the plaster. And that's never fun, trying to get that off and get the model out of the plaster. So that parting line really helps. That line I drew at the beginning really helps create equal pieces so that there isn't any overhang. Now on these feet, there really isn't overhang or undercut, basically. But anyway, that might be something to look into when you are beginning to make molds if you're interested in that. That's really important. So I'm pushing it down and just trying to get that bottom half buried completely up into that line. And sometimes I just take a really long time doing this, but I will push that clay up into that line and up to that model so it's a nice seal all the way around, and it's a nice straight line. These parting lines, it's helpful to have them clean and straight. When you use the mold later on, it'll make a big difference. Now I'm making the spares out of clay, or the pour spouts. So this is where you create an opening in this part of the mold. So when you put the two halves together, it creates a hole that you pour the liquid porcelain into. So this is called a spare or a pour spout. I don't know. I just form it with the clay and make sure it's sealed up against that foot, and it's essentially half of what the spare would be. So half of this will be formed, and then the other half you'll do it again in the other part of the mold, and it creates a hole. I just cut it off to meet that straight edge because I'm going to be putting my mold box sides up against it. We want everything to be flush and up against the mold box. And so the spares have to be like that too. So see where they're located at the bottom. Now what I'm doing is creating a key. It's an indent that will form these little bumps so that when you put the two mold pieces together, they'll lock into place in the right orientation. So I do that in the first part of my mold. The second part you don't have to, because it'll flow over those bumps that you just made. So it's basically the opposite, mirroring what you're creating with the plaster. Now these are my dirty mold box. You can use so many different things to create a mold box. I like to adjust it, so I have 4 pieces that I can adjust and use these clamps, and they're just an acrylic, and then I used foil tape to hold the ends together, which isn't the most useful and best way of doing it. Like I said, I'm not a professional, but this is the stuff that I use. And I just make sure that they're nice and flush as possible. And I'll show you how I make it even more flush, because we have to seal this up, because then I'm pouring liquid plaster into it. So I'm doing this over wax paper in my she shed. I don't do this inside where I dress the dolls because it's just really messy. And honestly, I think I could have smaller pieces of acrylic. I don't even remember where I got these, but you can get adjustable mold forms, and it's kind of similar to this, where they'll have pieces that you put together. All right, my next step is I will take Sculpey clay and I will seal the outside bottom edges. I just roll a messy lump of clay and then I push it up against the bottom edge to seal it, just in case any liquid plaster wants to come out of there. Liquid plaster is really messy, so this is just a way to prevent it. I do it on all 4 sides of this box. And I push it down onto the surface and then up against the mold box, and I push in the sides as much as I possibly can without squishing that original clay bed. So now those corners there, I need to make little sausages of clay to seal those up as well. So I usually, it's hard to see at this point, I press with my finger down into that corner, make sure that whole corner is sealed, and then I will smooth it out. And this is also really, really important to make a clean mold. And yeah, I mean, a lot of people ask where I learned, and there didn't seem to be anywhere I could actually learn how to make a mold. So I just started buying books, and there was some online resources, and then really it's a lot of trial and error. Like, no one's actually taught me how to do it. And then coming up with that recipe for plaster, that took some math. And that wasn't, I did it once and now I have the recipe and I'm good. So, here I'm showing you I've sealed all those 4 corners, and now I'm using mold soap. This is really important so that the plaster will separate away from the models. It's even more important in the next step, the second half of the mold. But I usually put on 2 or 3 layers, so I will put this on. It's not necessary to put it on the clay bed that the feet are buried into. It is on the second half, but this half, no, because the plaster is not going to stick to the clay, but it will stick to the feet. So I'm covering the feet with the mold soap. I'll do like 2 or 3 layers and just make sure it's a nice thin layer of mold soap. Anything extra, I just kind of pick off with a brush. And make sure none of it's pooled around it. So it's a nice slick surface over the models, the feet. Sometimes I call them prototypes. So I have a clean container for distilled water. And my recipe, the recipe has everything to do with volume. I use 8 ounces of water to 0.7 pounds of plaster. Make sure you always wear one of these when you're working with plaster. I have a yucky little container that I put the water into, and then I leave that other one aside and clean. I've already weighed out my plaster, and so then I pour it in. I don't do any special fancy way of doing it. In fact, I'm sure there are better ways of doing this. You just don't want bubbles, but I always have a lot of bubbles, so I'm still working on how to fix out the bubbles, especially when I'm doing a head and a body. The feet, not such a big deal, because if there are little bubbles, they show up on the porcelain piece when it comes out of the mold, but you can clean that up. So you try not to agitate it too much, and you try not to stir it. And as you can see, I have one gloved hand, and that's the hand I'm going to stir the plaster with. Okay, here's another thing I'm doing. You're going to see the consistency of this plaster. Now I've sped up the film here. I usually go a lot slower, but the plaster for some reason is set up super hard, set up super fast. Actually, it started to get hard sooner than I expected. So when you see me pouring this half, it just looks like pudding. It should not be that consistency. It really shouldn't. And this is painful to watch, but I made it work, and it's not a perfect mold, but I'm like, it's literally crawling out of this container. I know there's mold makers who are like, oh girl, no, because that can create a lot of problems, and being that thick. I'm just trying to spread it over the model. You can also brush plaster over the models and then pour the rest over. That helps. And then I'm tapping it on my workspace to try to make the bubbles come up and out. Yeah, like I said, the consistency of that was not very good. Turned out all right though. As you can see here, I'm taking it off. I'm taking that clay off. There's the clay bed. And then here on the left is plaster. So I'm doing this again. So now it's the plaster bed with the feet in. I'm doing the opposite side. Those little keyholes made little bumps. I've sealed everything in with the clay. Made sure my feet are down into that plaster bed. And this is where you've got to take mold soap and put it all over the surface of the plaster bed that the feet are in, and the feet. And I do this 2 or 3 times to make a nice barrier, because plaster will stick to plaster like nobody's business, and it's impossible, well, unless you break it to get it apart. So now here's a good example of the perfect consistency. Now there's a lot of bubbles, as you can see. I don't care so much because they're feet. But if I tap that, sometimes people have vibrating little tables that you can put the plaster on and it'll vibrate all the bubbles up to the top, which is amazing. Sometimes there's a vacuum chamber as well, but these are just for my own use. And I'm again just tapping the hole or dropping the whole thing to hopefully get the bubbles out. But there's the second part of my mold. I'm just gonna let it set. And here we are taking it apart, and yeah, this is a 2-part mold. It's really, once you get the hang of it, it's like such a wonderful freedom to be able to sculpt what you make and then make a mold from it. And then, whatever material you use, I use porcelain. You can make silicone molds and use resin, but I do porcelain, so the plaster is perfect for that. At this point, it's still a little soft, and the first half of the mold, I did kind of carve it up a little bit. I didn't hear. I wanted to take this apart and show you. There you go. There are 2 parts, 2 plaster parts, and then I'm going to take the feet off. I'm going to show you how it looks. So then the keys match and go together so it stays locked. Oh, right. And this is where I wanted to show you. I kind of shave off those rough edges because it's still a little soft, and I'll do that with a knife. There's various tools you can use to shave and smooth the edges of a mold, because before it's completely cured, you have this time to do this. And I like to make my molds, not hard to handle. no too sharp edges. So I'm just showing you a little bit of what I did there. And then as you can see, the 2 portholes are right there, and it's stuck together. And then once it dries, I can use it for porcelain. Thanks for following me, and thanks for watching. Have a great day.